Well, hello there and welcome to this first edition of Granny Rainbow Beard's Red News. I am indeed your host, Granny Rainbow Beard, but there's no need for formalities. You may call me Granny. We're all friends round here, and if we're not, why not? Let's build some bridges together. No need for us all to be squabbling amongst ourselves. There's enough going on out there. So on tonight's edition, we're focusing on the question at the back of everyone's minds. When did Great Britain become racist Britain? Warning, this report features members of the white community, the black community, the Jewish community, and a dog. In today's current climate, if one were to speak of a white man or a black man, strangely, the whole ethnic group would get clumped together. Equally, if I were to mention a Jew, one might think that one was talking about the Jewish community as a whole. But this is nonsense. For example, say this little fella here jumped up and bit my bottom. He'd have to jump quite high, let's be fair, bless him with those legs. If he were to jump up and bite me on my bottom, rendering me unable to sit down for a day or two, do you think that would make me cross with all dogs? I don't think so. It might make me have a few strong words with this chap and maybe get him trained in a way as not to do it again, because let's be fair, no one wants to be bitten on the bottom, but I certainly wouldn't hold it against all the other dogs. Certainly not. Just imagine what the world would be like if we could use this same analogy with our brothers and sisters. I think we'd all agree that the world would be a better place, don't you? We here at Granny's Red News would like to state that just like any other reputable media outlet, namely the BBC, Channel 4, Fox and CNN, to name a few, we remain completely fair and unbiased. So whether you swing to the left or stand to the right, you'll see us right at the centre of every story. All links and articles used within this broadcast are shared for your reference, and we strongly advise that you take some time to look into any of these areas yourself, if you do so wish. If you hear something in this broadcast and you find you're not in agreement, by all means we welcome any points of reference that may be presented as a counter-argument, and let's get into a friendly debate about it. So in order for us to find out just exactly when Great Britain became racist Britain, we'll be taking a look at current affairs across the world today, as well as taking a trip back through history. Why go back through history, you ask? Well, I'm sure we've all heard and understood the laws of cause and effect, action and consequence, and what we do now will affect what is yet to happen, and equally, what happened in the past has created the world we see today. So we here at Granny's Red News value the importance of history as well as today's current times. So let's firstly take a look at what's been going on in the world of late, shall we? Let's look at the racial attack of a black male that lost his life at the hands of a police officer in broad daylight. Here's an article from The Economist from 2019, and there we can see the headline, "The killing of a black Jew sparks protests in Israel." The article reads that a young black man had been shot by an off-duty policeman and the circumstances were unclear. Thousands of Ethiopian Jews took to the streets in protest. Their claims of systematic racism, however, and police brutality were met, on the whole, with condescending denial. The article then goes on to say that complaints of racism have been generally dismissed. In 2012, it says, the Ethiopian Israeli activists were scolded by an immigration minister telling them to say thank you for what they had received. Well, pardon me a moment of humanity, if you will, but that must have felt awful. Especially considering that the article then reads that Ethiopian Israeli minors are 3 times as likely to be arrested as their non-black counterparts. In fact, it then says, and that it is indeed natural to be more suspicious of Ethiopian Israelis and Israeli Arabs, but yet complaints of racism were dismissed. So to all our viewers, I would like to retract my opening statement of this story being a racial attack. I think we can see that that clearly wasn't the case, so I will retract my statement, but we here are never too proud to change our opinion when presented with facts, and I hope that's something we can all allow ourselves, that same flexibility. So the previous article failed to give details of the victim, so we did a little bit more research, and here's an article we found from the Times of Israel. So the victim was named Solomon, and I apologise if I get this surname wrong. The victim was named Solomon Tekka, and he was 19 years old. There he is, look. So we here at Granny's News would like to send our thoughts and prayers to Solomon's family and friends and to his wider community. And we ask, may justice prevail. So moving on to our next article is that which we believe was indeed a racial attack, and that is the death of George Floyd. Unlike the case in Israel, the police officer was on duty, and we do know of the circumstances, and we were told that he has been called to the scene of a crime. Unlike the case in Israel, this is being called a racial attack, and complaints of systemic racism and police brutality don't seem to be dismissed. Nor are the rioters being told to say thank you for what they have received. So here we move on to an article from Sky News, and here's George Floyd, referred to as the gentle giant who was in the process of turning his life around until he was apprehended by a police officer that kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes. Now, let's just think about that, shall we? Doesn't this just highlight the world we're living in? I wouldn't have been able to stand round there watching a man reach the end of his life for 8 minutes, let alone stand there filming it. I would have been on that police officer dragging him off. Come on, get off him. I've been able to just stand there, watch. There's a time for observation and there's a time for action. I would have said that's a time for action. Get that police officer off him. And again, we here at Granny's Red News would like to send out our thoughts and prayers to the friends and family of George Floyd, and may true justice prevail for all. So on that note, we would like to direct your attention to this beautiful young lady who has made her own video on George Floyd, and as you can see here, she's saying he's not a hero. She's certainly not condemning this man to death, by no means of the matter, but she's maybe just highlighting why people might not want to be walking around with his face on their t-shirts. So if you haven't looked at this video, we do suggest that you take a glance. You can find it here on YouTube. As stated at the beginning of this broadcast, we do feel it's important to look at all sides of every story, especially when dealing with sensitive subjects such as this. This way we can get a much bigger picture and we can start to make some sense of it all, because I think that's what we all need, isn't it? Is to start making sense of what's going on in this world. One thing Candace Owens mentions, and one thing apparent in the killing of George Floyd, is indeed the police brutality. So let's take a look at this next article from the Los Angeles Times from the 4th of June 2020. The headline reads, "A very abbreviated history of police officers killing black people." Now here, this is a very moving image of a man stood at the site where his brother was killed, and his sign reads, "Justice for all victims of police murder." Because let's face it, the police are there to serve and protect, not to attack and kill. Come on. These are meant to be here to protect us. So the last sentence at the end of this article reads, "One common thread running through the many deadly incidents is that the victims are disproportionately black." Now, can you imagine how it must feel knowing that you are the victim of targeted attacks just because of the colour of your skin? Can you? So our little team of journalist detectives, as we call them, wanted to see the statistics and figures of this police brutality. And we'd like to be honest with you and say that we were quite surprised at what the statistics actually showed, I can tell you. So here we have a graph entitled "Number of people shot to death by the police in the United States from 2017 to 2020 by race." So firstly, let's look at the races that are specified on this particular chart. It specifies white, black, Hispanic, other, And unknown, and again, if I'm honest, that baffled my brain a bit. Unknown. Anyway, moving on. So, according to statistics, the number of people shot to death each year shows that it's disproportionately white. So that then led us to the question, is the issue really about race? Or could it in fact be that the issue is about police brutality and those in power? Well, according to the lawyer of George Floyd, he claims that a pandemic of racism led to his death. And here we can see that headline on this article from the highly respected BBC. But where and when could this pandemic of racism have started? According to Afua Hirsch, from this article taken from the Guardian newspaper, the racism that killed George Floyd was built in Britain, and as the article continues, as we'll see, it needs to stop in Britain. It reads, as long as you send all children out into the world to be actively educated into racism, taught a white supremacist version of history, literature and art, then you are setting up a future generation to perpetuate the same violence on which that system of power depends. We are telling you that we need to dismantle, not to de-escalate. Pay attention is how it ends. And I read that and I got my finger out. I started pointing my finger, I did. Pay attention. So let's try and understand what this article is saying, because I don't think they've made it very clear. And that's the problem when you get ambiguous news reports, because it can make one think up all sorts of things. So, if I've read it correctly, it says that the white supremacist version of history, literature and art needs to be dismantled. Well, excuse my moment of humanity once again, but wouldn't that be a shame? Honestly, no more learning about the ancient Greeks and their many philosophers. No more learning the words of Shakespeare. To be or not to be. Well, Shakespeare, I think you've had your lot. I think it's the latter. No more shall a thespian speak your words. No more shall people gaze amongst the wondrous works of art of Picasso, of Leonardo da Vinci, of Monet. But alas, yes, it seems to be true, because here it says why we need to do more than speeches about the problem of whiteness. I didn't know there was a problem of whiteness. There's a time for talking and a time for action. So what they're saying, enough talking, let's get to the action. And sadly, for my personal loss, it looks like the first thing to be dismantled is classical music. That's right. Oh, what a shame. It's time to let classical music die. And here we have an article from New Music USA. It's time to let classical music die. But why? Why, I hear you asking? Well, because classical music is inherently racist. So let's draw attention to this particular paragraph. The few scraps given to minorities are overwhelmingly white, occupied by white, cisgender, women, or the LGBT plus individuals. Now, on a slight interjection, we will be looking into intersectionality in a later episode, so stay tuned for that. But back to this story, the article then goes on to say, the few people of colour who are given access to institutional space are most often light-skinned and non-black, while also exoticised and tokenised. Well, for goodness sake, get this author onto Google. We don't want them feeling left out. Show him Google, for goodness sake. And so if this author feels that people of colour are underrepresented in the institutional space, remind them of the MOBO Awards. Music of black origin. Remind them of African music, of jazz, gospel, reggae, for goodness sake. This is enjoyed the world over. So please, if you know the author of this article, show them what they've been missing in their Google searches. So let's return now to this problem of whiteness. The previous article from The Guardian has already mentioned one key problem of whiteness, and that was the element of white supremacy. So what other elements are there? And here's an article, White Guilt. You may not have heard of this phrase, but let's see what this says here. White guilt is the individual or collective guilt felt by some white people for harm resulting from racist treatment of ethnic minorities such as African Americans and indigenous peoples by other white people, most specifically in the context of the Atlantic slave trade, European colonialism, and the legacy of these eras. Another element that we can look at to the problem of whiteness is stated here is that of white privilege. Again, some of you may not be familiar with this, so let's see what it says. So here it says white privilege or white skin privilege refers to societal privilege that benefits white people over non-white people in some societies, particularly if they are otherwise under the same social, political or economic circumstances. And again here in this next sentence we can see that it mentions European colonialism along with the Atlantic slave trade. And to compare these two definitions, we can see that there are quite a few common threads that link the two together, but for the sake of today's broadcast, we're going to be looking at the Atlantic slave trade. Now we here understand and appreciate that this is an extremely delicate and sensitive topic. So if you would rather step away from this broadcast, please feel free to do so now. So here on Wikipedia we can see the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade or transatlantic slave trade involved the transportation by slave traders of enslaved African people, mainly to the Americas. The slave trade regularly used the triangular trade route and its Middle Passage, and existed from the 16th to the 19th centuries. Taking a look further down this same article, it reads, "The major Atlantic slave trading nations, ordered by trade volume, were the Portuguese, the British, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch empires, and the Danish. Several had established outposts on the African coast where they purchased slaves from local African leaders." So from this article we can see that the transportation was mainly to the Americas, yet the Americas don't get mentioned in the final paragraph as we've just seen. However, it does mention that the slaves were purchased from local African leaders. Now, my humanity is going to creep in once more. Could you imagine betraying your own people and selling them off to a foreign land to be forced into a life of slavery? That's if they even made it there alive. The conditions on those ships were so inhumane that many African men died whilst at sea. Now, as a lover of history, I can honestly say that I feel that this to be one of the most violent acts of history, if not the worst. So looking at this article, our team of journalist detectives, as I've said we like to call them those, sensed that there was maybe a missing link. The fact that the transportation was mainly to the Americas, yet the major trading nations were of those in Europe. So with a little more research, our journalist detectives came across this article by a man named Dontel Jackson, and the main article reads, "An African American apologises for the misattributed perceptions of white racism against blacks perpetrated by Jews." And at the top of his page you can see the title, Jews and the Slave Trade. So here we are, we've clicked on that page, Jews and the Slave Trade, and here it says quite clearly. So please feel free to check this man's website if you feel drawn to. But we here wanted to verify if this information was indeed accurate. So our team did yet a little bit more research, and they came across this article. And we can see here on this site, My Jewish Learning, with the title, Jews and the African Slave Trade. And it reads, "Like many others, Jews participated in the transatlantic slave trade, but they by no means dominated it." So my question is, why are these not on the Wikipedia page like many others? Don't be shy, come on, not fair Not fair for the Europeans to be in the spotlight. And so we continued our research a little bit further, and we came across this site, Nation of Islam Research Group, and here Jewish slave dealers and owners. And if you look at that article, the title, towards the centre of the page, it says this ADL book praises Jewish slave owners and dealers and calls notorious slaving firm kindly. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you won't mind if yet again I step in as a human being here, but I can't see how anything or anyone with regards to this subject could be called kindly in any sense of the word. And there at the bottom of this article, it reads, the following Jews were known dealers, owners, shippers or supporters of the slave trade and of the enslavement of black African citizens in early New York history. And as you can see here, there's quite a few names. I've not been bothered to count them because in my eyes, one would be far too many. And having come across this extensive list of Jewish names, our team wanted to look for the names of the European traders. And I have to say, they struggled to find many names. The one name they did find, however, was that of a Captain Luke Collingwood, and he was the captain of this ship that you can see here, called the Zong. Now, I won't go into details of what the African men had to endure under the hand of this man, but I will say that the actions of Luke Collingwood were brought to the attention of a man named Granville Sharp, and he used the death of the slaves to increase public awareness about the slave trade and further the anti-slavery cause. And it was Granville Sharp who first used the word massacre. Now, thank goodness this man stood up and took some action to increase public awareness of these horrors. But who was Granville Sharp? So as we can read here, Granville Sharp was one of the first British campaigners for the abolition of the slave trade. He also involved himself in trying to correct other social injustices. And just skipping to the final paragraph there, it also states he was also a biblical scholar, a classicist, and a talented musician. So let's hope that his statue doesn't get pulled down, eh? Well, even if there is one, I've never heard of him before. And here we have another article from Wikipedia, and this end section had already been highlighted for us. So it reads, Britain abolished slavery throughout its entire empire by the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, with the notable exception of India. The French colonies re-abolished it in 1848, and the US abolished slavery in 1865 with the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution. So I make that around 32 years that the US was continuing with this abhorrent behaviour once Britain had finally come to its senses and said this must stop. So, returning our focus back to the title of this broadcast, and the racism of Britain, and I think it's important to actually look at the definition of the word racism. So let's just have a look at this article here. It reads, racism is the belief that groups of humans possess different behavioural traits corresponding to physical appearance and can be divided based on the superiority of one race over another. And just skipping a sentence, there, number 3, look. Modern variants of racism are often based in social perceptions of biological differences between peoples. So this was interesting because I'd recently come across a video on YouTube, as you do when you're just, at home, bored, and you're thinking, what should I do? I'll stick the YouTube on. So, and I found this video and I thought, how very, very interesting. So let's just have a look at the title of that video. And here he is, one of the greats, if I may say so myself, Mr. Muhammad Ali. If you have not watched this interview, I highly, highly recommend it. It was fascinating to observe, and I'll tell you, I certainly would not call Muhammad Ali a racist. Certainly not. Surely he's entitled to share the views he has. So we've looked at, well, we haven't looked into white supremacy, The Guardian have done that for us, but we've looked at white privilege, we've looked at white guilt, we've looked into racism, so now let's look at the word racist, and this is the definition here from the Oxford Languages, and it says, racist, a noun, a person who shows or feels discrimination or prejudice against people of other races, or who believes that a particular race is superior to another. And take a look at the definition they've used. This is a very interesting use of words to describe this word. I had a fear of being called a racist. Well, that's an interesting use of language there. So anyway, let's look at this next video. Again, something I came over onto YouTube. Again, flicking over, what can I do? Stick the tube on. And here he is, the Dalai Lama, stating his view that Europe should be for Europeans. I mean, can you imagine? I certainly wouldn't call the Dalai Lama a racist. I don't you stick a white man on that YouTube saying that, I know exactly what he'd be called. It's fascinating what's going on, isn't it? And again, if you've not watched this particular video or this interview, please do. I mean, he explains why it makes sense. I think people are entitled to their opinion. I would not call the Dalai Lama a racist. Certainly not. So just what exactly is the problem of whiteness? Could it be that there's just too many of them? Well, according to this Channel 4's reporter, Mr. Jon Snow, that would seem to be the only problem of whiteness. And here he is. Well, no, he's not live on this video, but when it was recorded, live, Channel 4, and he's, if you've not watched it, go and watch it. He says, I have never seen so many white people. Well, guess where he is? You're never going to guess. In fact, we're coming to the end, so we'd like to leave on a light-hearted note. If you want to grab yourself a pen and paper, or, you just shout the words at me, we'll give you 10 points. If you can guess, or if you know where on this planet Jon Snow is reporting, saying, I have never seen so many white people. We'll give you a few seconds. You have a think. Well, for those that didn't know the answer, Jon Snow is in London, England. It's very strange that he would say such a thing. I have never seen so many white people in London, in England. Where's he been living for all of his life? So we're drawing this broadcast to a close, and firstly we'd like to say thanks for tuning in. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting. We appreciate many of the areas covered in tonight's broadcast. They are delicate and they are sensitive, so we appreciate one must tread lightly when delving into such difficult conversations. But we do feel it's important to raise issues. We really do. So before we close, we would just like to honour and respect this amazing man, if I do say so myself, highly good looking, if I do say so myself. So let's just look at these words of Malcolm X on the media. He says, the press is so powerful in its image-making role, it can make the criminal look like he's the victim, and make the victim look like he's the criminal. This is the press, he says, an irresponsible press at that. It will make the criminal look like he's the victim, and make the victim look like he's the criminal. He goes on to say, if you aren't careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. Interesting words, Malcolm. Thank you for sharing. And how would it be even possible to have a broadcast without mentioning this wonderful, wonderful woman, Mother Teresa? And she says, I was once asked why I don't participate in anti-war demonstrations. I said that I will never do that. But as soon as you have a pro-peace rally, I'll be there. I'll tell you what, Mother Teresa, I'd be there as well. Pro-peace? Certainly. Pro-life? Certainly. Pro-freedom? Certainly. Certainly. Pro. Let's be pro. So now it's time for Granny's final thought. So let's take our eye back to the case of George Floyd. There he was, on the ground, under the knee hold of this police officer. Now, this police officer is being blamed for the death of this man. So for the final thought I'd like to leave you with, who is it that's really responsible for the death of George Floyd? Was it the police officer in action? Or could it be said that the bystanders that stood there, doing nothing, watching, aren't they equally as responsible? As I said earlier in the broadcast, there is a time for action. That would have been the perfect time for action. The police officer was taking action. Just because others around him were inactive didn't stop someone being active. So from all of us here at Granny's Red News, please do join us for our next edition, and we wish you all the best. God bless.